Oh, thank you very much for having me, first of all. I was usually asked like people like Dutch or English, but I don't know Dutch, so I'm gonna stick with English.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's good. And again, thank you very much for having me. My name is Ahmed Taha. I've been working for 15 years in Microsoft Technologies, Web and Integration, uh, mainly in Middle East and Africa. Before I came here in the Netherlands last year, I'm working with Capgemini in financial services. Um, ABN AMRO, so it's good to know that. Everybody, I think, in Netherlands and IT, usually 1 out of 5 maybe. So yeah, that's my background. I love talking about integration projects. I invested a lot of time and effort in learning about integration patterns, integration styles. I was talking to you about prior to COVID, I went to conferences all over the world. Architecture conferences just to learn about architecture styles, integration styles. I'm an avid reader as well. I read tons of books about all the topics, like specific topics in technology, architecture, and even business strategies as well. So I try to cover it all. Today I'm going to talk to you about one of the use cases I faced a few years back. That's talking about how to re-architect integration solutions and move them from on-prem to Azure. I'm going to talk first about the context, just to give you the lay of the land, what was there, and then we're going to talk about the challenges. It's quite good from time to time to reflect on these experiences, especially after years go by. When you're immersed in these experiences, during that time, you don't see it. You have a tunnel vision about what needs to be delivered. And it's quite interesting to look back from time to time to learn from it, actually. I'm going to touch on some techniques we used, good and bad. I'm going to take your feedback as well and questions, of course. And of course, we have questions and remarks and feedback from you. And feel free, because we're a small group. Let's talk about it. So it's a few years back project for a retailer. Mainly, it's a very competitive market at that time. Competition is way ahead of them. They are Microsoft shop, which is good to know, Microsoft experience. And they have mainly an integration platform that handles stateless real-time integrations for point-to-point integrations that were already there. So actually they did some effort and tried to decouple these integration points, the point-to-point integrations, with BizTalk Server. Already huge investment, and it's already implemented. Then there was a downtime incident that happened later on that was really devastating to the business, to the extent that they wanted to look for other solutions, look at the cloud, which was then already proven technology, but still new to them. So I would like to talk to you about two aspects: the organization aspect, which the challenges we faced from organization perspective, and the technical ones. The reason I don't want to be judgmental, like I'm not judging them for having these types of challenges, but actually I'm reflecting back and seeing what went wrong and what was on the right track. So I think the main challenging point was the readiness of the organization. So basically, they were responding to the downtime incident that they had. So this was the main driver for moving to the cloud. So looking back, I think the organization readiness, or how much were they ready for adopting the cloud, I think it was not there. They had a vision, but I don't think it was complete. So this is mainly the organizational challenge. From the technical one, we will go through each one of them. But of course, moving to a cloud architecture is totally different from a monolithic type of architecture on-prem, where everything is just one deployment unit. You have to deploy, everything is under control, everything is under your vision within your network perimeter. Then now to the cloud. So big bang. It's a huge big bang for the organization. And we will talk about a little on the disaster recovery and business continuity, just what they were trying to, again, avoid downtime, I can tell you how many times I got business teams attending the meetings, stressing on this, time and time again, because of the impact that it had. And of course, we will talk about the integrations and how it was really volatile and how we used certain techniques that try to minimize the impact of these changes. Okay, so from an organization perspective, I'm sure you are familiar with the cloud adoption framework, but we will go through them. But mainly we were in these two stages. We were a partner for this organization, the Microsoft partner, working with the organization, but we were involved in the design and the actual migration and modernization stages. These are the two stages, the ready and adopt in the cloud adoption framework. Back then, the cloud adoption framework was just released. So it was in 2019, 2018, by that time. These stages, now again, reflecting back, I think it was not really thought through. So, for example, like the business justification, what are the business outcomes? Again, it was driven by the incident that happened, but what else are you trying to achieve? Are you trying to increase the time to market, for instance? Are you trying to decrease costs? What are the business value? What are the business outcomes you're trying to achieve? We were not involved in this, but we were kept hearing in these meetings during later stages about we have to have like high availability, we have to have to keep up with the competition, we are adding new features quickly and all that. But I guess these stages were not covered. One of the points that we'll talk about later is the skills readiness for the team. And how is the team aligned within the organization about this movement? In certain meetings, we got people randomly asking about, but why again are we moving to the cloud? So I don't think there was alignment looking back at this. Of course, there is also the security and managing and governance. Security is included partly in the design of the solution, in the implementation, and later on in the monitoring of the solution, making sure everything is intact. Managing of the solution, this became a challenge later on because who's managing what exactly? Are we working with DevOps model? Are we working with a separation from development and operations? Because again, they are coming from an on-prem mindset. And the governance was also a big problem. So they used mainly RBAC, and policies was not in their vision, actually, which was because they want to control everything. This is how they worked on-prem. So let's dive into two parts of the readiness and how because of the lack of this readiness, how it impacted their decisions. Again, I'm trying not to be judgmental, but at least reflecting back and learning that I was there at a certain point in time. I was like in a snapshot there, but maybe some things have evolved and changed in the organization. The first is the one-to-one mapping mindset, which is like, okay, we have this on-prem, we have this BizTalk on-prem, we want to replicate everything. We don't want to lose any feature. But do you really need these features? That's one. Do you need to replicate architecture? Remember, these are two different technologies, totally different technologies, and they cannot really be mapped. You can try to mimic these services and the behavior of it, but you typically cannot replicate each and every component. So this is one of the challenges, again, based on the readiness of the organization. The second point is the big bang transition. You wanted to move fast and at one time. Again, okay, good and bad. This can be done, but with the complexity of the IT landscape, it was very difficult. And it has to be done in transitions, in stages, where you're trying to, first of all, limit the impact on all the dependencies you have, which is the service consumers and the downstream systems. That's on one end. On the other end, you want to iterate on the design. You want to learn from this. You want to learn from all these challenges that you will definitely face when you're moving from on-prem to the cloud. What if you have like performance issues? What do you need to have? What if you have something that you need to include later on? So all these transitions will actually give you the chance to iterate on the design and learn from the issues that you face. The third part is really interesting. I remember the IT director coming to us and asking, okay, so how much will it cost? Okay, on premises it's easy. You can count the license, number of cores, number of platforms, SQL Server, BizTalk Server, web servers, and that's it. You can get to a number, and you can just pay it, and you're done. Maybe in 10 years or so, or maybe 5 years, you can pay for extra support, but that's it. Here in the cloud is different. It's an operational expense, and this is, again, a different mindset. So it's important to rethink the architecture. So when we moved to the cloud, actually they asked for, okay, are we losing the message box? Message box here is just a data store that acts as a queuing mechanism. But the question became, from our side, do we need this queuing mechanism? When we did our analysis, most of the services actually were stateless and synchronous. They didn't really need the queuing mechanism. But at the other side, we have this as an option. We can use a service bus queue, or a service bus topic, in this case, in a pub/sub manner. But to understand that we don't have to have each and every component replicated, and we have the chance actually to rethink the architecture, to see what can we do to achieve the same outcomes. We don't have to replicate it in a one-to-one manner. And the phase transition, the big bang part, it's always good to look at the cloud adoption spectrum, which is as a spectrum, which means that you don't have to be in one end or the other. You can be in the middle, in hybrid. So during the movement, you will be in the hybrid. Maybe the target could be the cloud eventually, to have all the resources in the cloud, but it doesn't have to be. And this is what I think most of organizations are starting to realize, that you don't have to move everything on the cloud if you don't need to move everything on the cloud. So you have to iterate, think, take it one step at a time and see. And just high level of what was happening here during the transition. So this is the very first stage of including Azure on top of BizTalk. So we try to reuse the existing integrations provided by BizTalk on-prem in the cloud. At the same time, we want to minimize the impact of the client applications. So any new integration points will be onboarded as an option. If you, as a client, if you want to have the new features, you can definitely get it. If you don't want it now, if you're not ready, we can wait. So this is the transition, and this is the stage of phased approach. Later on, we want to decommission, but through these stages, there are intermediate stages where we actually re-implement some of the existing integrations gradually, side by side, with the new integrations. And we will talk about this later, but the abstraction that we include here for the internal implementation will hide these changes as much as possible. This doesn't mean that we have zero changes for the clients. We try to minimize the impact to a great extent, but at the same time, we want to encapsulate all these changes behind an abstraction layer. And yeah, this is literally the question that we were asked. Where is the bill of quantity for this solution? Of course, we can do this activity of breaking down all the services that we have, all the SKUs that we selected, all the number of instances that we are expected to have, and then use Azure Calculator to calculate everything, use buffers for expected growth, number of integrations, business interactions, and all that. And we can come up with a number, right? But it's not a bill of quantity, unfortunately. We can estimate it, but it's not as concrete as a license of a number of cores as it was on-prem. The other part of the readiness, as I told you before, it's about the DevOps or the lack of DevOps and moving to the cloud at the same time. So DevOps is an engineering practice, and it really looks for actually dynamic types of IT landscapes and IT environments. When we talk about the cloud, it is very hard to work with a traditional software development lifecycle. So imagine that you have to create tables like this and trying to say, okay, operations will do one thing, development will do the other. That creates a lot of coordination in deployment. You have to wait for someone to respond to your ticket for creating certain environment or certain infrastructure, and then you can do your work. So again, it's a snapshot in time. Doesn't mean that it is wrong at that time, but it's part of the evolution. Okay, now let's shift to the technical part. So coming from a monolithic type of architecture, and one of the requests we were talking about, like the architecture characteristics, or what we call like non-functional requirements, is basically like performance, availability, of course, because of the downtime incident. So again, this is the on-prem kind of setup. But imagine that this is the Azure architecture. This is not the final one, but imagine that this is the one. So compared to this, this is a distributed architecture with a lot of moving parts we have here. Doing the same thing, by the way. Again, some meetings, we got some people like, okay, but after seeing this architecture, but why are we moving to the cloud? Again, part of the readiness is alignment within the organization. You need to align within the organization to get the buy-in from the team, or the teams actually, in-house in that organization. So a lot of moving parts means a lot of challenges here. It's a trade-off. So we have the power of the cloud, we have everything, we have new features, we have new capabilities. We are handing off a lot of the stuff of the data centers and offloading all of this to Microsoft, but still we have to take care of a lot of things now, a lot of moving parts. BizTalk was just one MSI package and you're good. You're deploying it to nodes, executable, done, and it's done. Web servers are there, just one deployment unit. Now you have to coordinate all this. Security as an aspect from an architecture characteristics was basically on-prem using the traditional setup. We have DMZ area, web servers, BizTalk servers at the back end and internal network, firewalls. So it's just spread across these, like infrastructure. We have firewalls, network perimeters, and all that. We have, of course, transport level security, TLS, and a message level security encryption as an option as well. And that's it. You're within the boundaries of your network perimeter, and it's done. When it comes to Azure, you have a lot of security controls. We went through each and every one with their architects. Because of our setup or our architecture, we have firewall, we have VNets, we have API management, we have logic apps, and within each, we can actually add different security controls in combination. One of the very frequent questions I get from the team back then is, do we have to have all these security controls? Of course, it depends, but the question was really saying that if we have it in API management, do we have to have it in logic apps? It's an internal network after all. The response is quite simple, that in the cloud, you have to assume breach. This is way before the zero trust model by Microsoft that's being renowned now. But you are in a public cloud. You are actually in a public cloud. And whatever you do, like trying to make it internal as much as possible, still the tricky part is ARM endpoints are still public. So there is a surface area that's exposed to the public internet, and this means that there is a possibility of an attack coming. Now there is authentication, there is authorization, I understand, but still there are hackers, there are techniques that you have to be aware of. So assuming breach and adding redundant security controls was one way. We didn't apply each and every one, but we applied the best practices of having, for example, Key Vault was a must-have, for instance. Stuff like IP filters were added as well to make sure that we don't have any calls. This is, by the way, the consumption logic apps, not the standard one, because this was way before that. So again, they were overwhelmed by the type of security controls doesn't match what they used to have on-prem. Of course, tracing and monitoring was another challenge. In BizTalk, this is the administration console. You get most of the issues that you face. This is a Microsoft Management Console, MMC. You can see event log. You can see the instances, applications running. You can see the instances across nodes from one node. And there are also tools that were implemented, third-party tools like BizTalk 360, which give them even a bigger kind of centralization. And in this case, you can have almost everything, and you don't have to access the BizTalk nodes. You can actually have it from a web-based application. So everything is under control, everything is centralized. We have everything we need when it comes to Azure. App Insights, definitely. You have to correlate and do all the distributed tracing across the moving parts. We have Azure Monitor, monitoring in Azure, activity logs. For example, here in Logic Apps, you have to, if something happened on the actual resource, you have to look who's done what exactly. We have metrics. So it's kind of different and distributed. It's not as centralized. There are efforts by third-party tools like Serverless 360. They are doing the same. They're trying to centralize things even more. Personally, I found a little bit of a challenge to explain Azure Monitor and because it has evolved quite a lot. Sometimes people get confused about what is Azure Monitor. Is it application insights? Is it part of it? And all the names and acronyms and what needs to be done in a distributed architecture is really a bit challenging. And even fault tolerance becomes an issue. This was part in the design, documented in the design. So we have a lot of moving parts now, a lot of building blocks in Azure. A lot can go wrong, actually. So if you think about it, it's an end-to-end responsibility from the all the way to the client to the back end. Anything can go wrong, whether it's in between these components or actually inside the components itself. So you can have an error in the logic in one of these components, or you can have like a transient network error, right? So you have to have like retry policies well-defined in your application. Timeout, you have to know what is the timeout of these back-end systems and what are the differences between these timeouts and how you kind of coordinate with that. You have to have standard error messages that will be exposed from your application. And sometimes you have to fail fast if it's a persistent error, for example. So all this becomes part of the designing of the solution. Compared to BizTalk, one deployment unit, all the components are there, and it's done. Okay, so moving to the volatility. What I mean here about how volatile it was for the dependencies. So in this organization, they were trying to integrate with a lot of systems, mostly external systems. Some were out of their control, and some was in-house, but they didn't have like maintenance for it. You don't have the source code and all these types of challenges that we face. So it was really, really challenging to have to introduce any sort of change in this type of layout. One of the techniques is to separate or try to decouple these integrations as much as you can, not only by having like a messaging or a pub/sub mechanism, but also in terms of the contracts itself. Meaning that let's have an internal contract or schema that we work with, and we have a stable schema that we expose to clients. So this technique is not new. It's been used for a long time, and it's similar to the N-tier architecture from a conceptual perspective, if you think about it. We are trying to control change. We're trying to limit the impact of the change to the external consumers of your service. So this is basically the layout of our integrations. We have an API management as a central gateway, Logic Apps that does using the connectors, does all the business process automation and integrations and connections. and we are connecting to the back-end systems. What we wanted to do is to abstract consumers from all these implementations, and we do the transformation, business process automation, and protocol mediations through connectors, and we expose a standard stable interface that is external, and we have a well-defined service description for our integrations. So this, on the long term, this doesn't work for all solutions. If it's really a simple one, it will be a huge overhead. It also provides us with flexibility of changing the internal components. So we can have an internal change without impacting the external systems as well. We assessed Azure Function Proxy initially as a lightweight kind of URL routing mechanism as a central gateway, but we definitely figured out later on that API management was the best option in this case. It provided many more features, whether it's like the caching, authorization, and transformation for these messages. And actually, we were right, at least because there were talks about Azure Function Proxy not being supported in future releases. And I think they are starting to announce something about that nowadays. I'm not sure. But I think I've read it somewhere that Azure Function Proxy will not be the way to go from future versions of Azure Functions. So this is how the flow goes. This is the policy scopes that we have for API management. Not sure if you are familiar with it, but you can have like XML-based policies that can be defined on the engine. So we can actually have on different scopes. I mean, like for example, you have a global one that goes across all the APIs that you have. You can have it as fine-grained as possible to the operation or the API level if you want. So this is how we used it. So we have like main logging that happens across all the APIs. Rate limits were an option. They didn't want to use it, but they had the option to use it on the product level, which is like a group of APIs. And any authorization was happening on the API level. Operations were having the caching, the message transformations. That's part of the decoupling that we are trying to do. And you can see the difference between the URLs, for example. Back then, of course, logic apps were the consumption-based. That was, now we have the standard that has one logic app instance and multiple workflows. Back then, you have to use the consumption-based, which was different URL. And even if you create a new one, it will come out with a different URL. So you definitely have to have some component that controls these incoming calls. Of course, the expressions that you can use also gave us a lot of flexibility when we do certain logic. The one just tip I used to tell the developers and the delivery teams is not to do business logic here at all. It's just for transformations only and preparing the messages and the headers of the incoming message. So this is the flow, like from the internal and external kind of transformation that's happening. So we do any request that's coming. Now we have external schema. We know the request, how it looks like, the response, how it looks like. We do the transformation before handing this off to the internal schema, to the logic apps, which is free to use this schema. And again, it has in itself like another mapping layer to do an internal to external. So it looks like a lot, and it is. But in the maintenance part, it's a lifesaver. So in a complex scenarios like this type of number of integration points, changes that's happening every now and then, it becomes really challenging to keep up. And this actually works in this case. But if it's a simple project, it doesn't make sense because it adds a lot of overhead. Sure.
Question before you move to the next slide.
Yeah.
Yeah, for this message flow, on the lower parts, I can see from internal to external.
Yep.
And from external to internal on the lower part. Is it that you guys have the API and you send broadcast to an external system, or the external is still within your domain?
Yeah, so everything here that's like these two components are our components.
Okay.
These systems are outside of us. These are external components, and these as well are external to us. And this is the way that we made sure that anything within our components is using the internal one. You just mapping to the external one, it's communicating with the external, or the external component is communicating to us. Otherwise, we work internally with the internal schemas.
Okay, so you guys are just more like the middle person.
Yeah.
That handles requests between the
Exactly.
user and also the consumer.
Exactly. Okay. And we sometimes do some mediation, like maybe we have service composition or trying to do business process automation, like orchestrating multiple services in some cases. Okay. And sometimes it's just one-to-one. And the reason for having one-to-one, because sometimes it doesn't make sense to have it like maybe service consumer can directly call the back end, but it goes back to the way of point-to-point integrations and how they get out of control with a certain number. It just got out of control, and you cannot untangle all these point-to-point integrations eventually. We used liquid templates for transformations. It proved a lot. We come from like BizTalk experience where we actually worked with XSL. It was quite similar in terms of the outcomes, but it's a totally different language in this case to do. You can do like, you can see here, for example, you can do for loops and all that. We are mainly working with JSON. It's also good to know, like, whenever we define the internal schemas, we can start with a replica from external schemas in some cases. So it's not, we can evolve it later on because we have the transformations under our control, but it can be a starting point as well. So this is how it looks like. From Logic Apps perspective, we have these components for, again, using liquid templates. Back then, we used integration accounts. This was the only way to use maps and included, like, for example, if you want to do XML transformations, you can use XSL still and add them in an integration account and then reference them from Logic Apps. So integration account was just an add-on that you had to pay for in addition to the Logic Apps consumption. Authentication, or in this case, authorization, was also handled by API management. I have a blog post written in details about this. It's basically like a client credentials grant type where you, with Azure Active Directory, you can actually register applications for each consumer. And whenever the consumer wants to call your service, it actually had to get the JWT token and use it to call your API. All this happens within API management using policies, so just an XML type of rule that you have to reference Azure Active Directory and the expected, for example, claims that you're looking for, and then you can do the authorization in API management. The last thing I want to talk about is the biggest issue that the organization had, which is the disaster recovery. Back then, they used BizTalk topology when it comes to disaster recovery using a technique called log shipping. This was an old technique in SQL Server that makes sure that all the distributed type of SQL servers are synced to a single node that acts as a redundant node or something like that. Unfortunately, it was not put in the right place, meaning that it was not configured properly. They didn't do like a rehearsal in terms of let's rehearse and make sure that we can actually fail over and then fail back. So this is how the incident happened. Luckily, it was a stateless type of integration layer, so we didn't have to maintain state across nodes. This is how we proposed, is to have two different regions in an active-passive manner, which is similar to what they had, but at least we have a totally different region. It's we didn't have to buy something data center or anything. And we use Traffic Manager instead of Application Gateway for certain reasons. Of course, Back then, application gateway was just released, and we didn't want any of the features of the WAF. So it was as simple as we need a routing mechanism in case of a failed node or a failed region, and to have some small downtime, but at least we can actually shift to the active region when we need. It's important also to mention that we highlighted, of course, that back-end systems have to have these types of redundancy. If you have an in-house kind of system that is in one data center, and if we fail over and they didn't, and they have the issue, then it's done for them as well. So, yeah, that's it. Of course, any questions or any feedback, remarks?
So when we look at the initial pain points from
Yeah.
the business side and struggling with competing, etc., what was the outcome after this migration?
That's a good question. I can tell you that, let me just go to the slide. Yeah. Well, first of all, they are still in the hybrid. They couldn't move everything, and they actually realized that they don't need to move everything. There has a lot of evolution that's happened to the architecture. It's not the way that I showed you now. The only part I think that's still there is the schema type of decoupling. They actually moved to the standard logic apps for some time now, like from last year or something. My understanding also that they changed some of the synchronous calls into Azure functions rather than going to Azure logic apps, but still they maintained the separation of the mapping between internal and external in this case. They are more DevOps, I would say. So they were on their way, but at the point in time, they were not. And they had to have a separation of responsibility between who's doing what from the developers and operations. But now, from my understanding, they embraced the DevOps, and at least they are using the tooling properly and practice in general. Yes?
Did things actually become more, let's say, available? Because, while distributed system is not per se more reliable than a monolith, lots of moving parts, like
Yep.
you said.
Yeah. So you mean that, is it operational?
Is it, did you guys have a lot of downtime issues while transitioning? Or,
Oh, okay.
did it work out like you planned?
Well, the downtime was there, to be honest, especially like the side-by-side implementations. There are a lot of coordination and communication that I had to handle with the consumers to convince them about what we are trying to do. So it was very tough to get the buy-in from the consumers. But eventually the organization had the upper hand on forcing the consumers to do it. But it was not, I would say, a nice experience. So it was not as seamless as we thought. It took more coordination and more time than we expected. So the side-by-side kind of integrations was there for a long time. This is the first stage of the transition, actually. So it was way more time than we expected initially.
Sounds like a very complicated transition, to be honest.
It is.
If you have a lot of integrations.
Yeah. It is. And we were trying to mitigate this impact, but we were sure that it will not be eliminated completely. We have to minimize its impact only.
What do you use for API gateway?
In API management, Azure API management, yeah. Yeah. And we also, just a good point to I remember, like we will checking if internal mode of the API management was a good idea to use or not. Because this part of the security, we wanted to reduce the surface area and make it internal, but it had a lot of challenges just to make it part of the VNet.
And then another question, you have these external services, so as
Yeah.
soon as consumer is requesting something from you where you need to request external service, you do a direct request. As I understood, you also have cache probably for some of them?
Yes, for
But
some read
maybe
operations, yeah.
You have some external resources which you call schedule? You have a schedule to call, for example, in the morning. Don't you have something like this?
No, for the scheduled one, I think there were some ETLs, but not real-time integrations, and this is what not in our scope. But I remember another team was working on like Azure Data Factory, if I can remember correctly, and SSI packages being ported to Data Factory. But this was something else. But this was mainly for real-time stateless integrations. This was our scope.
What kind of disaster recovery options have you used? Because I've worked with, well, let's say multi-region Azure deployments, etc.
Yeah.
And that worked very well until our credit card got rejected and all our regions got disabled all at once.
Yeah.
There were a lot of scenarios you need to handle with the cloud.
This is a great question because whenever I communicate with the client about this, I try to manage their expectations. A lot of sales architects, I don't want to say from which company, but you know, I think, trying to say that everything will work magically, and it's not the case, and I have to be realistic. And of course, like doing POCs to the clients is good approach, but it's not production, right? Yeah. So I think, to your point, there is a lot of challenges to make this work. Of course, it's never gonna be a zero downtime. There will be some hiccups, and this comes to the fault tolerance part. We expect from our clients, according to our design, that they need to do some retry mechanisms. They have to do some graceful type of error handling in case of hiccups that happens during this transition. For the downstream systems, it's another story. We have to make sure that they have the same SLAs, I would say. And this is the biggest bottleneck and biggest challenge. And we tell them if we rely 100%, because we are stateless integration layer, we're trying to decouple these layers, we have 100% dependency on the backend systems. So if the backend systems are not redundant, this is fake. This is the literally what I said to them, that you have to make sure that the redundancy is matched and replicated all the way across the system. Otherwise, it won't work. So, does it answer it?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, but there were different options if you like.
Yeah.
Front door was one option. Back then it was new. Again, hiccups are there. It's not instant like coming instantly from one region to the other. I think when we went to the traffic manager was because of the performance kind of approach. Like this is like a DNS type of routing where we don't have to go through another layer, like Azure Front Door with the WAF and all the policies and all that. Just as simple as a DNS type of routing. So it was, from a performance requirements, I think it was matching what we wanted. And we used the priority traffic, like an active passive. If one node is there, it can go to the other one. But to answer your question again, it is not seamless, and it was not implemented, by the way. Yeah.
Okay, I have one basic question. So suppose you had a hybrid environment before.
Mm-hmm.
So end users were using those all the services what we have. So now after moving to cloud, so what is the end user experience? What advantages they are getting after moving this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think first of all, the organization or the stakeholders there, mainly the IT architect, was really driven by the incident that happened, and he wanted to move the cloud as the silver bullet for the availability and all that, which is one part. They had some ideas in the future, for example, back then in the future, now it's the past, I think, but they wanted to have, for example, they've seen that some POCs regarding machine learning and artificial intelligence and the sentiment analysis, again using logic apps with the sales architects. So they said, oh, we can actually analyze requests on the fly, and we see that how customers are, they are sad or they are. So you got my point. So it was a canvas of endless possibilities for them. So I think this was one of the main drivers. We were not involved in these initial discussions about the strategy of the company. But this is what we got through our discussions with them in the design phase.
For the reliability of the entire service, how did you guys manage it? Because you mentioned you try to see that your backend services also, or your external clients also have SLA that they maintain.
Yeah.
But what are the metrics you guys use in measuring, like for your SLIs? Okay, these are the things we're looking at.
Yeah.
We have the APIs, is it the latency, the success rate?
So it's actually 3 things we used. According to the requirements, it was the performance, which is latency and throughput. These are 2 metrics that we used with the backend service systems. And of course, the availability. So these are the 3 metrics that we used: availability, latency, and throughput.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I'm in the reliability
Yeah,
systems.
yeah.
That's why I'm asking this.
Yeah.
Because one thing I've noticed from the reliability side of things is we try to measure performance. Performance might be good. Your latency might be nice. Your availability might be 100%. But success rate is always an issue. Because you have clients from different regions, different workspace, and there might be some challenges that is specific to a set of clients. It's not affecting the entire system. Your latency is fine, your performance, your throughput is fine, your availability is fine.
Yeah.
But there's this just set of people that are having some hiccups, and with the success rates you can easily track what is happening. Most times we always look at it, well, we are fine. But when we don't try to drill down to what percentage of our clients have some successful calls on our end, then it becomes also difficult to manage issues later, because it might just be something small and you didn't take note of it, it grows, and it just becomes a big mess.
Yeah.
And everyone tries to.
So I think it's a very good question. So this is part of a bigger picture of, like, of course we have like client applications that handles like CRM applications and trying to improve the experience of end users. We are part of the integration part, which is focused more on the technicalities of integration points. But I think the overall success is very important, and I was not involved in this part of how to improve the end user experience or the overall success of the project, which has a lot of like parallel teams working on CRM and other front-end applications that can measure such success. But from usually, like when we are working in integration layer, we are sometimes seen as the back-end guys who are focused on the technicalities more than the system itself. Like whenever something goes wrong, of course we are to be blamed, but the other way, whenever it goes right, using all the relevant metrics for the API integrations, nobody just gives us any call. They just, okay, things are working as it's supposed to, so thank you for that. Yeah. But to your point, I think it's important to see the overall success in stuff that's other than the actual metrics, to see if it's actually, I think it goes back to the part of the business value of doing all this actually and moving to BizTalk and then moving to the cloud, whether it worth it or not. Yeah.
Just one, I wanted to know, like, that the convincing part, you were saying it was hard to convince the client to move to the cloud. I understand from one point, like, yeah, we have an on-prem system, it is working, we have some incidents, we could solve it, so why should we move to the cloud, right? On which basis, like, normally, like in our environment, we are like trying to do some proof of concept.
Yeah.
To show the benefits, and then we will go like step by step and presenting it. How you did this? Like,
so we didn't actually. We were not part of why they moved it. This was the part of the cloud adoption framework that I mentioned. I think it was skipped, the part that they didn't actually do that due diligence when it comes to why we are moving to the cloud. We came in the design phase as a partner to Microsoft to implement or design the integration layer. But actually the movement to the cloud, I think it was rushed because of POCs done by the sales architects from the vendor and the major incident that happened that replicated across the organization, and they have to come with a solution. And I think that was the main drivers for them, but we didn't actually convince them to move to the cloud. We are the other way. We were trying to tell them that hybrid is an option. On-prem is still an option if you do disaster recovery properly, but they wanted to, okay, cloud is the new thing. We have to follow our competition.
Buzzword.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, because it is like, for a customer, okay, cloud, I need something to work, for example, simple.
Yeah.
And it should work, and it should be cheaper, and for example, and for me, most of the time, I'm difficult challenges like I'm getting here, how to convince them, like, okay.
Yeah.
Spending a lot of time on presentation, showing them this is happening, this is happening.
It also depends on the stakeholders, like whenever I'm getting into our meeting room and to do stuff like that, I have to boil it down to what matters for them. Is it like gonna save costs is it gonna save on the timeline in future? Are they gaining a lot of money because of it? It has to boil down to some of the basic business values. Otherwise, it doesn't make sense to do it again. Yeah.
And imagine you come to a consumer who has a PHP project with a web hosting for $5 per month, and you say like, go to cloud, it will cost you whatever, like $1,500 per month. And like,
I think you're very lucky that you were not a part of that discussion.
No, indeed.
Because what we see is like we are getting a lot of headache in that part, convincing, especially the management, okay, you're implying this will happen, okay, show us a POC. You're preparing the nice POC, and then, okay, what's the customer benefit? Okay, then you're explaining customer benefits, what's the budget? Okay, we were saying that will cost us money, we said, no budget.
No, it's
6 months for nothing.
Yeah, but it's always, I've seen it time and time again. Certain sales architects has like some charisma type of, they have a presence and they can convince you. I was convinced, like in another project, like, okay, it makes sense to move the cloud, even though that later on I was, oh wow, that's magic. That it has nothing to do with, I think, for example, I remember now, like one organization was convinced to do microservices with zero experience in Docker and Kubernetes, for example, just because it's the new and it's a huge organization. And I've seen the demos, I've seen the people talking. It has to do with the charm and the charisma and the presence. Business stakeholders are like, wow, that's what we are looking for. That's the new thing. And then
we need it.
If a rule does it, it makes sense for us, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Where should I put my credit card number?
Exactly. Yeah.
And one more question.
Yeah.
Might be like you were started this implementation. How the first question as a management, as a PO or something, I asked how you want to provide education to the end users as well as our team.
Yeah, true. First of all, like it took, I think, like 8 weeks to get my team, who's an experienced in Azure, to get them up to speed with the best practices of especially delivery, like even the naming conventions by Microsoft. Of course, I had to get them early on the architecture, just not to give them like, this is the architecture, you have to implement it, but just get them engaged in this early on. The other thing is that I think the biggest headache was the actual release or the delivery part, where we have multiple components. API management had a certain technique for deployment. Of course, all boils down to ARM, but your application on top of the infrastructure had to be also deployed with a cadence. In addition to the coordination with the operations teams from the organization initially, which took some time as well to fine-tune and iron all the challenges. So I think it took maybe like 8 weeks for us to before we get started. But for the end user or for the operations, it was a different story. They had to have like some external trainings done properly. They had a strong team, by the way, but on-prem. They know the technology quite well. They have knowledge in SaaS applications of Office 365, Azure Active Directory to an extent, but they maintain the separation of operations. Like we have the RBAC, we have the control. If you need something, you create a ticket and we do it for you. Yeah, so this is how it went.
And you were coordinating this project?
I was architect for this project.
Yeah.
I had leads who were delivering this, very, very experienced ones. I sometimes, as an architect, I acted as a facilitator as well. So, especially when talking to consumers and external systems, it was a big challenge, but it was, yeah.
As an architect, so you're designing the solution, right? So
Yeah.
you design the solution, and the engineers, okay, now this is the solution implemented,
Mhm.
right? So were you also involved in the implementation?
Yeah, I was.
In the planning, for example, how to execute and how long
Yeah,
it will
yeah,
take
yeah.
to execute?
We did that. So
Yeah.
all the timeline and planning has been done already, like all the estimations of the breakdown of the tasks, even to the fine grade of each logic app would take some initial time because I know the team that's going to work on it. I try to do this type of governance on the architecture. So time and time we go through sessions of reviewing the architecture, reviewing the challenges that the team faces. Again, one of the biggest challenges was to deploy all these moving parts and coordination. And having them in more or less type of a one central ARM template. Back then we were using ARM templates only. So I was keeping in touch with the team. I even relocated my desk to be, this was pre-COVID by the way, so I was relocated my desk to be in the same floor as the team so they can reach me quickly. It was a very big project and a lot of stakes was.
And your solution engine was based on what experience?
So I've been working in integration architecture in general for past like 15 years in general. Before this project, I was working in Azure project as well, Azure Integration Services. My very first project was with Azure Logic Apps before the modern, before Azure maybe. But actually before the API management was there before. So this is my experience. Of course, we leverage some of Azure architecture frameworks or architecture center just as a foundation. But yeah, that's it.